From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, Consider This with Kathy Wyatt, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
Why does the United States use the Electoral College to pick the president? The Founding Fathers were split. Should Congress choose the president, or should it be left to the people? The use of electors was the solution. When you cast your vote for president, you are deciding which electors will represent your state. The number of electors in each state is determined by how many seats in Congress that state has, and that number is based on the state's population.
Nebraska Governor Jim Pillen says he will not seek a special session to change the state's electoral vote. Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to the 28th season and this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, winner take all. Joining us to talk more about the proposal is Randy Atkins, professor of political science at UNO. Thank you so much for being here and welcome back.
Thank you. It's wonderful to come back.
All right. We're going to start by putting up a map for our viewers, and as we're doing that, Randy, tell us how many electoral votes are there?
Well, today there's 538 electoral college votes, and that means there's one vote for each senator and one vote for each member of the House of Representatives. Now, the Founding Fathers, as the video said, did that because they thought the number of electors should mirror the number of members of the House and Senate, but that they shouldn't actually be members of the House and Senate. So they decided there should be a different body of people who would pick the president other than the elected congressional representatives, therefore sort of separating power, you know, as we think about the separation of powers. Originally, the electors were chosen to exercise their own judgment on who they thought should be president, and of course in the original two elections, they all chose George Washington to be president, and they did that unanimously. I can't imagine we would have a unanimous election today, though.
Yeah. 48 states, winner take all, which means what?
Well, so every state gets to decide how they want their electors to be allocated, and that decision is made by the state legislature. In 48 out of the 50 states, the state legislature has chosen to do that on a winner-take-all basis, which just simply put means that the candidate that wins the greater number of votes in the state is the candidate that gets all of the electors from that state. So we've got 6 states plus the District of Columbia that have 3 electoral college votes, but we've got the state of California that has 54 electoral college votes. And in each of those instances, they're allocated on that winner-take-all basis.
Okay, thank you. And Nebraska and Maine, different how?
Yeah, so in Nebraska and Maine, what we do is we allocate our electors, the two that represent the senators, on a statewide basis. So, so whoever wins the greatest number of votes within the state wins those 2 votes. And then each congressional district, that elector representing that congressional district is allocated based on who wins the greatest number of votes within that congressional district.
Okay, and how many do you need to win?
Well, so if we have 538, the Constitution requires, now it doesn't require that we have a popular vote majority, it requires that we have an electoral college vote majority. So there must be a majority of electors. So if we have 538, the magic number that's needed to win is 270. In 2020, President Biden won 306. President Trump won 232.
Okay, we're going to put up the governor's full statement here. And as we're doing that, talk to us about what Republican lawmakers were trying to do here recently.
Well, it's really very simple. Their intent was to introduce and pass a law that would allocate all 5 of the electoral college votes from Nebraska to the presidential candidate with the greatest number of votes in this election cycle. That's it. That's all they were trying to do.
Okay, and on the 23rd of September, those hopes were dashed because State Senator Mike McDonald stepped in. Now, before we talk about what he said, for viewers who don't really know that much about this lawmaker from Omaha, what can you tell us?
Yeah, so Mike McDonald previously served the city of Omaha as the chief of the fire department. And then in 2016, he ran for state legislature. In 2020, he was reelected to the state legislature. And in 2024, he's term limited because of our 2-term limit. So he's now basically finished up his term as a state legislator. He's a lifelong Democrat. but he switched political parties back in April at the end of the legislative session. In part, that was because there were a couple of high-profile votes where he ended up voting with the Republican Party instead of voting with the Democratic Party.
Okay, all right. So drill down a little bit. Why then was the focus on him?
So it's really a procedural question. There are, in the Nebraska legislature, even though it is a nonpartisan legislature, and that means that people don't run under a party label. But of course, all the legislators in the Nebraska legislature, all those state senators have a party identification. So if you look at their party identification, one of the things you'll see is there is a majority of Republicans in the legislature. But every bill that comes up in the legislature that can be advanced to the floor is subject to a procedural vote called a filibuster, which is a vote to end debate on the bill. And you have to have a 2/3 majority to end debate on the bill. Now, the Republicans had 33 Republicans. There's 49 legislators. That doesn't get them to the 2/3 that they need. They need 34. So Mike McDonald became the 34th Republican in the state legislature. So he could, and he did in a couple of other instances, cross party lines and vote with the Republicans to end that procedural filibuster. But this issue never came up in the regular session.
Okay. Quite a bit of pressure on him, needless to say, and yet he still, as I said on the 23rd, stepped up and said no. Talk about the reasons behind that no, Randy.
Yeah, well, first thing I think I would say is, he let everybody know when he switched parties that this was a no vote for him. At least that's what my memory says. It wasn't something I think that he, sort of came out and said in his statement or anything. I think people asked him the question and he said, no, I just don't think it's time to do that. Okay, or I don't think he didn't want to do it at that particular time. And I honestly take him at his word on this. I mean, he said, one, it's too close to the election. We're within just a couple of months of the election, and he thought that was just too close. I think that's a very reasonable thing for anybody to say. And then second, he thought that it was an issue that was better suited for voters to decide in a referendum process. And we do have that ability in the state of Nebraska to vote on issues directly on the ballot if they're placed there before us. And so, he's saying, let's vote on it in 2026 when we have a midterm election.
Okay, and that stance that he has taken and took, what could that mean for the future of his own political career? Yeah,
well, I think it has a big impact because if we look at the 2nd Congressional District, Omaha lies within that 2nd Congressional District. And let me just talk a little bit about the city, the county, and the district. So the city of Omaha, if you look at the partisan makeup of the city of Omaha, give or take, this is always give or take, but give or take, there are usually a few more Democrats in Omaha than there are Republicans overall. And of course, there's a large nonpartisan vote. And then if you go to the county, it's very evenly divided in Douglas County. And again, still a large nonpartisan vote, but it's pretty evenly divided. And if you go to the 2nd district, there's a few more Republicans than there are Democrats, again, with a large nonpartisan vote. So if somebody wanted to run for higher office, and I'm not specifically talking about McDonald here, but if somebody wanted to run for higher office and they wanted to run in this district, maybe they want to run for mayor, maybe they want to run for Congress at some point, they're going to be thinking about how issues are going to play in the district. Because that's the constituency, and when I say the district, but that district of the mayor, the district of the 2nd Congressional District, they're going to think about how things are going to play there in that district, what the voters are going to want in that district, because they're going to want to be thinking about how to represent them, because that's effectively what they're going to be doing should they win office. Okay, thank you. And just this winner take all, when could we as Nebraskans expect this issue to come up again? I mean, it comes up in every legislature. I mean, every session of the legislature, somebody introduces it. It just doesn't really gain enough traction because of the procedural question of getting past the filibuster. So once the leadership realizes it's not going to get past the filibuster, they just schedule other things because the legislative session is not that long, and there's a lot of business to conduct. And so you're not going to end up talking about it unless you know it's probably going to get passed, or unless it's just a really, really critical issue. Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, President Biden won with 306 to 232, and it was very similar for President Trump in the previous election cycle in 2016. One vote doesn't matter. Why does it become important in this election cycle? Because, as we'll talk about in a minute probably, this election cycle is that close. It is possible that one vote could matter this year more than it has in other years.
Okay, I do want to now ask, before we get to possible outcomes of the presidential race, last time you were here, we were talking about a potential pick for Harris, right,
Yeah.
for her VP. So we didn't quite get there. Now we're there. So I wanted to ask for your opinion as we roll some video here from the Walz rally in La Vista. What do you think of this guy, and what does he do for this effort?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is that he is probably, so far, the most important choice that Vice President Harris has had to make, so far, and maybe potentially the most important choice she ever makes if something would happen to her. So it's the choice of a vice president. It's an important choice, but it's not always a choice that is going to have great ramifications unless something happens to the president. But I think a lot of people, when we talk about the Midwest broadly speaking, and so let's talk about the Midwest from Ohio all the way to here in Nebraska. When we include in that, Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Indiana and Illinois and Iowa and all these states in the Midwest. When we think about the Midwest, often our values in the Midwest, and I'm not necessarily talking about liberal or conservative values, I'm talking about our values, like the values that we have in common, things like family and things like that. Those values are often not represented on the coast. Because things on the East Coast and the West Coast are different than they are here. And so one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of election cycles is the choice of Midwesterners to be vice president. So, we can go back to, 2012 when Mitt Romney chose Paul Ryan from Wisconsin, and so we can think about 2016 when President Trump chose Mike Pence from Indiana. And so that's sort of what Harris is doing. Harris is saying, I want to make sure that Midwestern values are represented in my administration. And so, some people have asked me, well, if they're conservative, they say, well, I'm a conservative and I don't think that Tim Walz represents me. Well, that may be true, and there may be a lot of people in Nebraska who are thinking, and greater Nebraska I'm saying, who are thinking that, Tim Walz doesn't represent me. But does he represent, sort of the people in the 2nd district better than he represents the state overall? I'd say probably yes. Does he represent people in the Midwest overall better than he does people in the 2nd district? I'd say possibly yes. But he definitely represents Midwestern values better than somebody from the East Coast or the West Coast. Okay. And so I think that's a really, really important thing, that geographic balance that is picked when you're picking a vice presidential candidate can be critical.
Yeah. You talk geographic balance. What about the balance between the two of them? I mean, you talk about Midwestern values, but as we're looking at the big picture, a potential president, potential vice president, talk about the complement or potential for complement there between the two of them.
Well, I mean, the natural thing that one always thinks of is, if the president came from the Senate, you want to pick somebody who was a governor. Who has executive experience, or if the presidential candidate came from a governor's office, they want to pick somebody from the Senate. So now that doesn't always happen. Think about Obama and Biden. They both came out of the Senate. Why did they come out of the Senate? Well, because they worked on the Foreign Relations Committee and they were really good buddies. Okay, but Donald Trump has executive experience. He picked somebody from the Senate to sort of balance that kind of experience. And so the experience question can also come into play too. Okay,
thank you. Now we do have a pretty big day coming up here, another debate, a vice presidential debate. It's October 1st as we put up the photo of those two gentlemen. What are you expecting from that debate? We're going to walk away with what?
Yeah, I'm not certain, other than the fact that we know for the first time in a long time they're going to be standing up instead of sitting at a table. But generally speaking, vice presidential candidates and vice presidential debates don't have a big impact on the race, but they could have a big impact on news coverage in the days following the race. And so that could play a role. One of the things a lot of our viewers might remember is that in 1988, in the vice presidential debate that occurred here in Omaha, Lloyd Bentsen and Dan Quayle made probably what was a big mistake in the debate, and he tried to compare himself to John Kennedy, saying, I have about as much experience as Kennedy had at the same point in my career. And he was speaking to Lloyd Bentsen, who was very senior in age to him and had actually known John Kennedy. And so, that line came through that was carried in a sound clip in the debate, after the debate in the news coverage, that really sort of changed the direction of the news coverage about Quayle, and probably had a big impact on whether or not he was able to eventually run for president in his own right. I would also say that I think the stakes here are probably just a little bit higher for Senator Vance. And the reason for that is Governor Walz has a long track record of government service. He has a long tenure in the House of Representatives. He's in his second term in the governorship in Minnesota. He's been in government service now for almost 20 years. So we sort of know who he is. He's been sort of tested, and there's a lot, good or bad, that people can say for him. J.D. Vance ran for the United States Senate in 2022. So he's very new. And so for him to get out there on that stage is an opportunity to sort of prove, hey, I can stand up here with a guy who's really experienced. And I can demonstrate that I can do the same thing he can do. And so I think he has a little more at stake, and we'll see how he does.
Okay. Now, I want to put up a photo of both Harris and Trump. We don't have that much time until the election. We've been kind of watching all of this shake out. What needs to happen? And you can talk about them individually, you can talk about them together, but what is it that really has to happen for them going into November 5th?
Yeah, I think they both have the same challenge. Okay, and it's really a big challenge. There are very few people in this particular election cycle who are undecided. I mean, Donald Trump is now running for president his third time. If you don't know Donald Trump and who he is by now, and have decided whether you like him or don't like him, and Kamala Harris is, she's now been vice president for 4 years almost. If you don't know anything about her at this point, there's nothing that's going to happen in the next 40 plus days that's going to change your mind. So I don't think at this point we have a lot of undecided voters out there. I think we have very, very few undecided voters. That's one of the reasons I don't think there's a lot of pressure to have a second debate between the two, because there's just not a lot of undecided voters. There's not a lot of opportunity to change people's minds. But there is an opportunity to do something else, which is you've got voters who know who they would vote for if they turn out to vote. So they're what we would call sort of a low propensity voter. They're following enough of the campaign, they know enough about what's going on, they've got a favorite team, it's blue or red, and they could turn out to vote. The question is, will they turn out to vote? And so right now, starting for the last few days forward probably, it's really been more about making sure that group of people on your side, on your team, those voters, actually turn out to vote. And so now it's not about getting new voters anymore. It's not about convincing people to vote for you. It's about getting the people who like you to actually turn out to vote. And just an interesting statistic. So 2020 was the highest turnout that we've had in this country since 1900. But it was only 66% of the voting eligible population. So that means 34% of the voting eligible population did not turn out to vote in 2020. And so I don't think we're going to get as high this year as we did in 2020, which means there's probably people who voted in 2020 that are not going to turn out to vote. So how does the Harris campaign, how does the Trump campaign get those people to turn out to vote? That's the critical question.
Well, and that was the question that I was going to follow up with you on, was what is it that they're going to have to do? But for now, what I do want to ask is, because there's been some discussions out there from the time that Kamala Harris, accepted this nomination, how has she changed going from this role of VP, right, to running for president. Is there anything that you've seen about her that has surfaced that maybe because she was and is VP, we haven't really noticed that much about her, but now that she is where she is and doing what she's doing, is there something that's come to the surface, at least from where you sit, where you're going, wow, I didn't know that about her?
I don't know that I would phrase it quite that way. I think the thing that's really been most interesting for me to watch is the way the campaign has sort of rolled out her presidential candidacy, because it's not something you can just jump into. I mean, yeah, you can go out and do a rally. And you can speak in public, and you can, but they were very careful about how they did things. They did the things that they knew they could get positive media coverage on, and they're letting her get the kind of experience that she needs to get in that mode. And that's very important, because she didn't have the opportunity to start running for president last year sometime, which Donald Trump started running for president again last year. And those are skills that people need to have. And it's one of the reasons that, the Iowa caucus has become so important, because candidates spend a lot of time there just practicing, just honing that message, just talking in groups of people, every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And as vice president, you do speak in public, but you speak in a different way, and you speak to a different kind of group of people. And so she was a little bit behind Trump. And I would say by now she's probably caught up to him in that respect. She was criticized early on, for example, for not doing a lot of interviews. Well, she's now doing interviews, and so, but again, the whole point of this thing at this point is not to convince people from the other side to vote for you. And there aren't a lot of undecided you can convince to vote for you. It's to make sure that the people who are interested in voting for you at all turn out to vote.
Okay. All right. We're going to put up another map here. And as we're doing that, tell us a few ways that this could shake out on November 5th.
So what you see up here is you see that essentially there are 7 states, the gray states, that make up the Electoral College. Now, as I mentioned a little bit ago, Donald Trump had 232 votes in 2020, 232 Electoral College votes. He needs to get to 270. So the one thing he has to do is he has to win the one state that he won in 2020, and that's North Carolina. So he needs to be able to hold North Carolina. That's very important. And then if you think about the rest of it, there's really some Rust Belt states there, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and then there's Sun Belt states there. So Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. So assuming that Trump can hold that one state of North Carolina, then he needs to go and pick up 3 other states. And right now he was in the average of polls that we will see, not individual polls, but the average of polls, we'll see he's leading by a little bit in Arizona. So that's probably one of the states he's going to win. He needs to win Georgia, and that state is pretty close, but I think I've seen the polls recently have him at a slight advantage, that average of polls that I mentioned. But the state that is dead even is Pennsylvania. And I think in this election cycle, everything goes through Pennsylvania. And so, so Trump has to pick up those 3 states and hold North Carolina. And then Harris needs to just hold 270. So she just needs to hold 270. But from her perspective, I think, she'd like to try to get a bigger win, given that Trump has said that he's concerned about the electoral viability and whether or not there's election integrity. And so, so we could have questions that are similar to 2020. The way you avoid those questions is you run up the score. And I just don't know that there's an opportunity to run up the score in this cycle.
Okay. Interesting year, to say the least.
Yeah.
Always a lesson to be learned. As we look back at this particular time, what do you suppose is going to be said? Or maybe what could we have done differently, just as you look ahead, knowing you're going to look back at some point?
Yeah, I think what we're going to end up saying is we're going to end up talking about sort of the realignment of the political parties that is occurring during this period of time. There are people who were, the groups that they were in were considered to be Democratic constituencies, and they've now become Republican constituencies. And there were groups that were Republican constituencies that we're now looking at and we're saying that they're Democratic constituencies. And they may not be by big numbers, but I think we are going through some kind of a realignment between the 2 political parties. And I think that hasn't completely played out. I think it's going to continue to play out. But we clearly have, for a number of years we had people who were Democrats who were uncomfortable being in the Democratic Party. We also clearly now have Republicans who are uncomfortable being in the Republican Party. A lot of those people haven't switched parties yet, but my guess is that at sometime soon they may switch parties. They're certainly switching who they're voting for.
Wow, okay, thank you. We have 2 minutes remaining. How do we watch for the results, Randy? I mean, this is a kind of a tense time for folks. I mean, they're on pins and needles. We don't have that much time left before November 5th. So in these weeks leading up and then getting to the 5th, what is it that we're supposed to be doing? Any advice?
Yeah, so I guess what I would tell people is, if you're watching your favorite cable news channel, which a lot of people do, and you can do that on election night, and they'll be able to give you the national level results. I would make sure that you're getting a balance. Flip over to their opposition. See what their opposition is saying. How are they presenting things? It's going to give you a view of how your neighbors are thinking about things. Whether you watch CNN or Fox or MSNBC or some other channel, one of the things you see is that, people get into these little echo chambers, and so they hear things a certain way, and you'll begin to understand, okay, well, that explains why my neighbor feels that way. And you might understand them a little bit better. I'm not sure we can change the news organizations, but we can certainly try to understand people better. And then I think the other thing I would say on election night is, watch your favorite cable news channel for the national results, but the Nebraska State Secretary of State's office is going to be publishing election results, and the local Douglas and Sarpy County, for example, their election commissioners are going to be publishing the results on their sites, and they release those results every I don't want to say few minutes, but usually within a couple of hours, and so you'll be able to get the updates sometimes before you'll see them on the local news.
Okay, thank you. Talking with Randy Adkins today about winner take all. I want to thank you for coming in and sharing your time and your expertise. I would imagine you're going to be back here sometime in the near future. But for now, thank you for everything that you're doing.
Well, I look forward to it, and you're welcome.
Keep us up to date. And thanks to the students who are working so hard behind the scenes. And of course to all of you for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television in the School of Communication. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call the UNO School of Communication at 402-554-2600 during regular business hours. Or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.